To create a registration form, we can start by creating a div with the class of container to store everything. Then we can give it a style, then a width of 400 pixels, and a height of 480 pixels so everything is in a specific area, and a padding of 10 pixels just to add some spacing. Inside of that container, we can create an h1 and put the text registration form because that will be the header for our full form. Then we can create a div and give it the style of flex because in that div, we will be putting our first name and last name input boxes, which will be next to each other. Inside of the display flex, we can create another div for the first name input box and create a label. Set that for fname, and then also give it the ID of fname, and then set the text in the label to first name. When we save it, we see our registration form and our first name. Then we can create a BR to stack the items, and then create an input, set the type to text, or keep the type to text, set the ID to fname because we named it fname in the label, and after we set the ID, we can give it a name of first name. So our last name input box is the same as the first name, so we can copy and paste that div, and we can change all of the names. So for the last name, change it for L name, change the ID to L name, and change first name to last name. Then for the input, change the ID to L name and the name to first or last name. So now that we've created our first name and last name, we can create our email address div outside of our display flex div. And inside of that new div, like we did above, we'll create a label. This time set it for email. And then instead of giving an ID, just set the text to email address. Then again, underneath that label, we'll need to add a div to stack our email address input with the text, and then create an input. So instead of keeping the type to text, we'll set the type to email, the ID to email, and the name also to email. That completes our email input box. So then we can copy that div because our phone number box is the same as the email address box, paste it below, and then change for email to for phone, change the type to tel, change the ID to phone, the name to phone, and then lastly change the text from email address also to phone. So underneath our phone input box, we want our city and country drop-down menus, which we also want to be next to each other. So we'll create a div, and like we did for our first name and last name input boxes, we'll give it a style and then a display of flex. Now inside of that div, we can create another div, again like we did for our first and last name input boxes. Create a label and set it for city, and then set the text inside to city. Now we'll create a BR tag, but instead of creating an input tag, we'll create a select tag. Set the name to city. So we can set the name to city and the ID also to city. So inside of our select tag, we want to add options for our drop-down menu, which can be done by using an option tag. So we can create an option tag, and we can have a value. So let's set a city. So let's do New York City. So we can add that text in. And then inside the option tag itself, we add the text New York City, and we have our first option. Now to add more options, so let's add 3, we can copy our option tag and paste it below 2 more times. So for our second one, we can change the value from New York to Los Angeles. And again, change the text from New York inside the option tag to Los Angeles. Then when we save it, we would have 2 different options. For our last one, we can set the value to Chicago and followed by changing the text to Chicago. Now if we go to our output, we see all three of our different options in the drop-down menu. So our country drop-down is similar to our city drop-down, so we can copy the div that has our city drop-down and paste it below. Then we can change for city to for country, and this time we'll give it an ID, so we can add an ID of country to it and then change the text city to country. But first, in the select tag, we can change the name to country and the ID to country. Then we can change our options. So the first value will change to USA. And then like we did above with the city dropdown, we'll change New York to USA. For the second one, for our second option, we'll set the value to Canada after we change our text to country. So the value inside that quotation marks, replace Los Angeles with Canada, followed by replacing the Los Angeles text inside the option to Canada. Then for our last option, we can change it to Mexico, so the value to Mexico and the text also to Mexico. Now in our output, we see our three options. Now that we've created all of our input boxes and drop-downs, we can start by making our submit button. So still in our container div, but under the div that we've given display flex to, we can add a BR tag to stack our items and then create a div. Inside that div, we can create an input, but this time we'll give it the type of submit and we'll give it a value. So after that quotation, we'll create value and set that to register. When we save that, we have our register button, and the rest we can do in CSS. So we can go to our head tag and create a link tag to our CSS file. So now in our CSS file, the first thing we can do is start customizing our body by adding a background. So we'll do background and then do URL and then go to Google, find an image, and then use that URL. And then we can do center and 100 viewport heights to make the image look nicer in the background. Then we can start customizing our container, so we can select that and set the position to absolute, the top position to 50%, the left position to 50%, and then we can do transform, translate -50% by -50%, so we can center all of our content. Underneath that, we also want to set an opacity to 0.9, and we will see more of a difference with that once we add backgrounds and some other styling later on. So after we add the opacity, we can move on to our div, so just div in general, make everything bigger, set the font size to 14 pixels, and then the font family to Verdana, Geneva, Tahoma, Sans Serif. Add some spacing by giving it a padding of 3 pixels and setting a background color of #FFF, which is white. So background color #FFF. Now we can start customizing our inputs. So underneath our div, we can select those. So to do that, we do input, and then we do a square bracket. So instead of curly bracket, we do square bracket, and then do type equals, and then in quotation mark, the type. So for the first one, we'll set the type to email, and then add a comma, copy that line, and paste it below 2 more times. So for the second one, change type to email, and change that to tell. And the last one, we can change it to text, and then after that comma, we can write the text select. Then we can add our curly bracket, and inside of that, we can set a width of 97%, a height of 35 pixels, which we can immediately see makes everything bigger. And then to round the boxes, we can add a border radius of around 3 pixels, And then to space things out, we can add a margin bottom of 1 em. Now the border looks a bit messed up, so we can do border 1 pixel solid and set the color to light gray by doing RGB 196. Set the green value to 196, and same for the blue value to 196. And then once we save that, we see a light gray thin border. After that, we'd like to customize our select tags. So we can do select, and then for that we'll want a bigger margin. So we set the margin bottom to 2 em, and the border. So we'll do border 1 pixel solid, like we did before, and then RGB 196, 196, and the blue also to 196, like we did above. Now we can start customizing our input type, and this one will be our submit input type. So for this, we can again use the square brackets, and inside we can set the font size to 20 pixels, the width to 100%, and the margin top to -20 pixels, and the height to 50 pixels to make it bigger. And we can see that, and to give it a better background color, we'll do background color and set to hashtag 2B94D3. So that gives us a blue color. And then the text, we want that to stand out, so we can set the color to white or hashtag FFF. To remove the border, we can set the border to none. And since it's like a button, we can set the cursor to pointer. So now that's customized. So underneath the submit, we can start customizing our H1. So we can set the font size to 30 pixels. And we want to also give that a background. So we'll give it a background color of hashtag 125 and then 77F. So that's more of a darker shade of blue. And to make that background box bigger, we can add some property, but first we'll set the color to white and the font weight to 600 to make the text look nicer. Then we can add a padding of 15 pixels, and then we can set the text align to center so it goes in the center of the registration form. To position it, we can start by setting the margin top to -10 pixels, and then we can copy that 2 more times and paste it below. For the second one, change margin top to margin left, and then change margin top on the last one to margin right. Now we see our header, and then the last thing we have to do is our city and country drop down menus. So you can do hashtag country and hashtag LName, which will customize our country drop down and our last name box. So in that we can just set the margin left to 20%. Then we can do our city and country drop down. So we do hashtag city and then comma hashtag country. Then we create the curly bracket, and then inside that we'll set the width to 170 pixels and the height to 40 pixels. So now they're bigger, and then we can add that comma there to add the spacing. Now for our first name and last name input boxes, we can select those with the IDs we gave them in the HTML. So hashtag FName, hashtag LName. Set the width to 163 pixels. We immediately see that will make it wider. And then to make it higher, we'll set the height to 30 pixels. And we also want to give our first name and last name boxes the same background color. So we can just select input, and then for the border, we'll do border and set to 1 pixel solid, and insert the same light gray color by setting the RGB to 196, 196, and 196. And then in our output, we have a full registration form. and we have created that using only HTML and CSS. And if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe.